כאן אנשים חיובים. נראה שהוא יוצא, אתה מוריד לו.
יש לך כדור בקנה?
להיות סופר. אתה עליו? אתה עליו? יוצא. סע, כן.
רגע, אני לא יכול לראות בגלל טלטלית. בגלל טלטלית כפרה.
מימוני, בוא לפה, בוא לפה, בוא לפה, בוא לפה.
יש שם ילד קטן.
לתת?
לא.
איך הוא מתכופף תמיד בדיוק כשנוקטים?
לוקח לך את הוורוד.
לא ורוד, אני על הכחול אני.
וואי, זה סרטון! יש! בן של זונה. איזה סרטון, הנה, תרוצו לפנות אותו. בטח שצילמתי את זה.
וואו, פגעו לי מישהו בראש.
מה זה?
איזה סרטון אגדה.
מה, לא ראיתי את זה, אחי.
אף באוויר עם הרגל כזה.
הוא גירד את הרגל, והוא יוריד את הרגל, הוא יענו ברגל השנייה.
חויה בן זונות.
Zvika Fogel is a new lawmaker in his party.
You talk a lot about security, but consistently there's more Palestinians who are killed in this conflict than Israelis. It's the Palestinians who need better security, if anything, isn't it?
כל מי שירצה לפגוע בי, אני אפגע בו בחזרה. ומבחינתי המושג מידתיות חייב להפסיק להתקיים. אז אני אגיד לך משהו שמאוד לא נעים לומר אותו. אם זאת אמא ישראלית אחת בוכה, או 1,000 אמהות פלסטיניות בוכות, אז ש1,000 אמהות פלסטיניות יבכו.
That's a racist policy for a government to have.
אנחנו יותר מדי רחמנים, הגיע הזמן שנפסיק להיות, אין לזה קשר לגזענות.
Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's guest is Miko Peled. He is here to talk about Israel, his background, his family's background, the Israel state, some of the influence it has through the Israel lobby, and the power it kind of gains from the Western world and obviously the United States. So I'm very pleased to have you, Miko, to speak about this important subject. How you doing?
Doing well. Good to be with you.
Yeah, so for people not familiar with you, I'm sure you've had to explain this a million times, so I apologize. Could you just give people your background and your family's background and kind of the activism you've done kind of since that?
Sure. So I was born and raised in Jerusalem as an Israeli to a Zionist, very prominent Zionist family. My book is titled The General's Son. My father was a general in the Israeli army. And I had grandparents and uncles and aunts and great uncles and aunts who had held prominent positions in establishing the state of Israel and then running the state of Israel for the first few decades. And then I embarked on what I call a journey, or the subtitle of my book, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. So journeying as an Israeli into Palestine and asking the questions, what's an Israeli, where's Palestine? If it's Israel, where's Palestine? If it's Palestine, where's Israel? And how do I fit into all of that? And so the book is really the story of the journey. And the conclusions, the realizations that I came to over the years of doing this, of this journey of activism, is that I had to make a choice at one point, and the choice was to either remain loyal to Zionism and to Israel, or to remain loyal to my values that include respect for human rights and respect for democracy and respect for people, whoever they may be, because these are two conflicting ideas. The state of Israel is a racist, Zionism is a racist ideology, supremacist ideology. And again, my family was very, very heavily involved in establishing this racist state and espousing this supremacist ideology. So I had to make a choice, and the choice I made was to remain with the values that I feel are my values, which are respect for human beings, respect for human rights, democracy, and so on. So as the result of that, I've been active for justice and in Palestine and so forth.
Yeah, just briefly, could you just kind of explain just kind of how deeply involved your kind of family's background is with the founding of the Israeli state and kind of beyond that.
Well, my grandfather on my mother's side signed the Israeli Declaration of Independence, so that's pretty prominent. I have a great uncle who's the president of the state of Israel. I have uncles and aunts who were, held all kinds of other important positions. And my father was an officer in 1948, which is, a seminal moment in the history of Israel-Palestine, of course, when Israel was established. And he was a general in 1967, which, again, was another, very important moment in the history of that country. And so, my family was heavily involved in the creation and the running of and the establishment of the apartheid regime and then maintaining the apartheid state for many, many decades.
Yeah, sorry, just there's a tiny bit of background noise coming from you. I'm not sure if is it coming from your computer or laptop. If you can't change it, it's fine. It's just because I could hear it a little bit.
It's noise. I think it's traffic. It's noise from the outside.
Okay, no, that's fine. Yeah, so you obviously mentioned it there. So you can just explain what Zionism is and kind of where it came from, and is it separate to Judaism?
Yeah, Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism. Judaism is a religion, and Jewish people can be of any nationality, of any race, of any color, of any, and so on. Zionism is an ideology, a racist supremacist ideology that says that all Jewish people around the world, first of all, are a single nation, which is not true. That their country is Palestine, which again is not true, not historically or religiously, and that the Bible, the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, is actually not a religious book, not a book of faith, but a history book. And that's the history book of this supposedly people called the Jewish people, which Zionism again claim are a nation, like all nations. And so over the last 150 or so years, 130 years, the Zionist, the Zionism as a movement has managed to establish itself in the world as a legitimate national movement and established the state of Israel on the ashes of Palestine. And so 3 years after the Holocaust and World War II ended, this organization that claims to be Jewish began or embarked on this project that involved horrific crimes against other people, massacres, ethnic cleansing, and the establishment of a racist apartheid regime, which is Israel. So it's very important to separate and understand that Zionism is one thing, Judaism is a completely different thing. And in fact, religiously, theologically, Zionism is the antithesis of Judaism. It's everything that Judaism rejects. First of all, it's secular. So, Judaism is a religion and Zionism is a secular movement. But besides that, the notion that Jews have a right to take Palestine from the Palestinians, steal their land, kill their children, is completely contrary to Jewish law. So this separation is extremely important. And one of the things that the Zionists have been doing very successfully is conflating the two. So you're in the UK, so as you know, Jeremy Corbyn was accused of anti-Semitism, and all the people around him, which were very fine people, many of which I know personally, were accused of anti-Semitism, even though they were the people who fought for humanity, who fought against racism their entire lives, including Jeremy Corbyn. But because they were either rejecting or heavily criticizing Zionism and the state of Israel, they were labeled as anti-Semitic, and the British press and the British political institutions all supported that as a result of the successful campaign by the Zionists, by the state of Israel. And so this is an extremely important point. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, so obviously you grew up in Israel. So I've heard you kind of tell your story of how you got to high school around that time, and you hadn't actually kind of heard of Palestine as a state. Obviously there was the Arabs. So what was it like growing up in Israel? And just briefly, kind of what was your personal journey? being from a family so involved in the Israeli state from its founding, how did kind of your own perception of it format to where obviously you've got to this point today?
Well, Israel is a racist state, and so the social the social makeup of the state is racist, of course. And being coming from European, being of European descent, obviously I was the privileged among the privileged. And so I went to a privileged school. All the people around me, all the other my classmates and so on, all had parents who were important people who were very much involved in important work regarding the state or journalism and things like that. And that was it. We were Israelis and we lived in Israel. And I was born and raised in Jerusalem. I never met a Palestinian. Most of the time, most of my life, most of the time, growing up, Jerusalem was already the West Bank was already occupied, and so Palestinians were part of Jerusalem, but the segregation is so deep, the city is so segregated that we never met, we never did anything together. It's completely two different realities. And it wasn't, I don't know, I think I was in high school, but when my father became involved, my father became very much involved in pursuing the idea of a two-state solution, which, as a former general, somebody who was, known as a hawk and called for war and, was very adamant about maintaining a strong military for Israel, suddenly he started talking about peace with the Palestinians. But again, from a very Zionist perspective, which called for a small Palestinian state on a fraction of historical Palestine, and even that made him, many people called him a traitor and so on after that, and couldn't understand why he was saying this. But that was when I started hearing about Palestinians, because my father would talk about the Palestinians, and then he met with the leadership of the PLO at the time, and he met with Yasser Arafat and so on. So I knew I was a little bit ahead of the people around me because I knew about Palestinians. We called them Palestinians. In my house, the PLO was not a bad name. It was not a bad, it was not considered a bad thing. So gradually I came to the realization that there is a Palestine and that maybe Israel is not as perfect as I thought it was. Still, I didn't think Israel was to be rejected. I supported Zionism. I supported the two-state solution, of course. And then when I was 18, I was drafted into the military. And the last year of my service, Israel invaded Lebanon. And, we just commemorated 41 years of that and 41 years of the massacre in Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. And I was in the military at the time. I wasn't involved in any of that. I was not a combat soldier. But and that was a watershed moment, not just for me, for a lot of people, seeing this criminal invasion of Lebanon, the murder of civilians, and so forth. So that kind of began the decline in the image of Israel, the decline in the image of the Israeli army, from my perspective.
Yeah, I recently watched your interview with Kim Iverson where you kind of go over some of these details where when you was drafted into the army, you went on like a patrol into, I'm not sure where it was, if Palestine, if it was Jerusalem or the West Bank. And it basically said, if anyone looks at you funny, break their bones. And you was kind of saying how you was going through a city. So it was incredibly busy. And I mean, you kind of have to break everyone's bones. Was that kind of one of the examples that kind of was a light bulb in your mind?
Yes, I mean the first year of my service, I was part of a combat unit, and one day they took us to patrol one of the big cities in the West Bank, and we were given handcuffs and batons. I thought, we're an infantry unit, why are we getting handcuffs and batons? And then our lieutenant came up and said, if anybody, you're going to be walking up and down, if anybody so much as looks at you, you break every bone in their body. Well, can you imagine walking in a city and suddenly this platoon of heavily armed soldiers, commandos walking up and down? Who's not going to look? I mean, it was an absurd idea. Of course, everybody's going to look. So what are we going to do? Start smashing everybody's? But that's the atmosphere, you know. It was the atmosphere of, you know, we're tough, and anybody looks at us, we're going to smash them because we're the boss. And that to me was shocking. I was pretty naive at the time. I wasn't expecting that kind of rhetoric at all.
Yeah. So you've mentioned a couple of times Israel is a racist state. So can you explain kind of what the current state of Israel is now? Is it an apartheid racist state, as you've kind of said? And could you just provide some examples to people not familiar? Even myself, you know, I've tried to, you know, look into kind of this subject, but it's not really taught anywhere in the UK. I don't think many people, probably my age or older, really understand, you know, kind of the differences in Israel between the Palestinians and Israelis. So can you just explain that dynamic, please?
Well, to begin with, Israel was established in Palestine, on historic Palestine. And it was established as a state that gives preferential treatment to Jewish people at the expense of the Palestinians. So right there you have, that's already apartheid. The first year, or the first couple of years of the existence of the state of Israel, there was a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing. Almost 1 million Palestinians were thrown out, and countless, literally countless, because I don't think anybody knows the exact numbers of Palestinians that were massacred. I mean, massacres and mass graves are being discovered all the time, you know, even all these years later. And then the state that was established was a state that declared very clearly that this was a state for Jewish people. Well, you declare a state for Jewish people only on a country that's an Arab country. That's already, once again, that's an apartheid state. And today, when we look at the kind of the bureaucratic legal reality, so you have all these different populations living under different laws. So if you're an Israeli Jew, you basically live in kind of a liberal democracy, more or less, regardless of where you live throughout the entire country. Between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, I mean, it's all Israel, and if you're in Israel, you can live anywhere you want, and you enjoy the same rights, and, you know, pretty much. Palestinians are divided into a whole bunch of different set of categories, and that each category carries with it a different bureaucracy and a different set of laws, all of which discriminate heavily against the Palestinians. So you have about 2 million Palestinians who actually carry Israeli citizenship, but that's only Palestinians who live in a particular part of the country. And their citizenship is nothing like an Israeli Jewish citizenship. You know, they have no, you know, in many cases, you have hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who don't have access to water or medical care or electricity or roads or, you know what I mean? I'm talking about citizens of Israel. And the laws that govern them are completely different than the laws that govern an Israeli Jewish citizen. Then you have the Palestinians who live in the city of Jerusalem. They are considered alien residents. Now, mind you, there are families in Jerusalem, Palestinian families in Jerusalem that go back, have a recorded history of 800 years in the city. I have more rights there than they do. I have citizenship. They are alien residents. You know, my grandparents immigrated 100 years ago. Their families have been there for, you know, 800 years, recorded, written history. Then you have the Palestinians who lived in what used to be called the West Bank. And I say that because there's no more West Bank. The West Bank is gone. It's all part of Israel now. But there are these ghettos, these pockets of Palestinian population that are enclosed. They live under a different set of laws. They live under military law completely. Then you have the Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip, over 2 million Palestinians who live with no rights at all. I mean, they're in a prison. They're in a concentration camp. Over 2 million people. Now, the country is very small. So 2 plus 2 is 4, and then another 3.5. That's 7.5 people that are being governed by Israel without rights, with varying degrees of lack of rights. And then you've got about 6.5 million Israeli Jews who have, you know, all the privileges. So that's apartheid. I mean, that's no correct question. It's apartheid, and it's a very brutal form of apartheid. You know, people who came from, you know, were active in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. You know, they always testify that they've never seen anything so horrible as what the Palestinians are going through. Even Africans in South Africa didn't suffer the kind of horrors that the Palestinians have to live through. And so that's the state of Israel. So people that choose to support Israel, and today in the UK, I mean, that's the entire establishment. There's no difference between the two parties, Labour, Tories. I mean, everybody, Lib Dems, they're all, you know, completely supportive of Zionism and Israel, which is like supporting any other racist supremacist ideology. You know, so as far as I'm concerned, they are racist and they support the worst kind of terrorism and the worst kinds of horrors by saying and declaring that they are Zionists. And this is true, you know, not just in the UK. It's true pretty much everywhere in the West.
Yeah, when I think it was Liz Truss, when she became prime minister, you know, said she was a Zionist. Keir Starmer, obviously the opposition leader in Labour, also said he's a Zionist. You know, something they kind of say. They always support Israel, you know, their right to self-defense. You know, James Cleverly, I can't remember his Secretary of State, kind of going around, you know, always kind of doing that. Our military obviously have quite a close relationship. Just on what you said with Gaza, you know, it's always described as like an open-air prison. You said, you know, a type of concentration camp. So when you say that, what do you kind of mean by that?
We have over 2 million people living, you know, half an hour drive from, you know, Tel Aviv, 5-minute drive from other Israeli cities where there's plenty of water and people travel and live freely, completely, have access to medical care and so on, food, nutrition, water. They're closed. They can't go in and out. They can't fish. They can't go beyond, I think, 3 kilometers or 5 kilometers to even fish. And Gaza has always been a you know, fishing you know, region, a fishing city going back thousands of years. The amount of food that's permitted to go into Gaza is based on a calorie count that Israel put together, which is exactly what the Nazis used to do with Jews in ghettos. They had a calorie count. And again, the number 2 million people, just sit down for a moment and think about that. We're not talking about a small number of people. We're talking about 2 million people. And of course, on a regular basis, Israel goes in and bombs and kills thousands, and injures tens of thousands. Now, these injured don't have access to medical care. And if you imagine a child in Gaza that has, I don't know, an ear infection and there's no antibiotics. Never mind a child who has a curable cancer but doesn't have access to the medical care because Israel won't allow it. On the other side of the fence, you have an Israeli child with the exact same thing, but they have medical care and they're going to be fine. So when we say apartheid, it's, you know, the details, you know, it's not just, you know what I mean? It's horror. It's a life of horror. And out of the 2 million people in Gaza, 55% are under the age of 18. So really, we're talking about a population of children that's being driven to hunger and just living in horror. I mean, they're living in horror all the time. And you know, what is it? 3 hours away from Rome. It's a 5-hour flight from London. I mean, it's very close. It's right there in the center of the Mediterranean. You know. And so again, when people say they support Israel and they support Zionism, they're supporting the worst kind of violence and racism.
Obviously, Israel is often, you know, described as a democracy. You know, over the last couple of years, there's obviously been some high-profile events with journalists being killed. So, what do you make of kind of Israel's interaction with journalists over the last decade or 5 years, or wherever you want to go with?
Well, Israel Israel was never intended to be a democracy. So it's not a democracy, and it wasn't intended to be a democracy, because if you have different laws for different parts of the population, you're not a democracy. Now, yes, if you're an Israeli Jew, then you do enjoy kind of liberal, like living in a liberal democracy, you know, anywhere else. But you know, Israeli Jews are only part of the population. Israel was designed and planned, and the execution was to create an apartheid state. I don't think anybody had any even the smallest idea that somehow Israel should be a democracy. Even now, the Israeli Knesset, the parliament, just rejected a call or a bill to amend Israel's basic laws, which are like the equivalent of a constitution, that would call for full equality for citizens. They rejected that. They rejected an amendment to a bill that would call for full equality for citizens. So how can that be a democracy? They just passed a law that says that if an Arab rapes a Jewish woman, his penalty will be double that of a Jewish man raping a Jewish woman. I mean, just think of, I don't know what kind of sick minds there are to think of these laws, and then imagine raising your hand when it's time to vote and voting, saying, yes, I vote for that. So it's far beyond, just the title of apartheid. It's far beyond that. It's not about that. It's about the detail. It's about the horrors that they're imposing on Palestinians on a regular basis. It's about the racist discourse. It's about the ability to talk about Palestinians like they're worthless and then kill them like they're worthless, like their lives are worthless. Israel has this policy of demolishing homes. Now, the entire southern half of the country is called the Nakab. Israel calls it, in Hebrew they call it the Negev, but it's a Nakab. It's almost 50%, and it's mostly desert. And there are about 300,000 Palestinian Bedouin who live there. Over the they've demolished about 10 to 12,000 homes in the last 4 or 5 years. Now, there are also Israelis who live there, and Israelis live in wonderful conditions. Some of the highest standards of living among Israelis are there, because it's a very fertile desert. There's water there and so on. How many of those 10, 12,000 homes that were demolished do you think are Israeli Jewish homes? Yeah. So the reason that they give for demolishing a home is that they built without a permit, or they remodeled without a permit. Well, Israelis sometimes built without a permit too. Sometimes they remodeled without a permit. You never see the army coming in and demolishing their home. And now they added a clause to the law that calls for the home demolitions, just now, that says that on top of the home demolition, and on top of having to pay for the demolition of the home, the Palestinians will also have to, they will have their electricity and their water and their phones disconnected. On top of the demolition and the fines and the payment for the demolition, they're going to have their phone, their water, and their electricity disconnected. Now, everybody knows this only applies to Palestinians, and this is for Palestinian citizens of Israel. It's far worse for the ones who live in other parts of the country, but this is just about Palestinian citizens of Israel. Now, Palestinians can't go and live in a Jewish town. Nobody's going to give them up. They won't never be able to buy or rent a house or a flat in a Jewish town. Never. It's not going to happen. So they have no choice but to build, but they're never given building permits. So they have no choice but to build without a permit and then take their chances. And there's thousands. There are, without the Nakab, just the northern part, the northern half of the country, and without the West Bank or Jerusalem, there are close to 40,000 home demolition orders. So imagine you live in your home and there's a home demolition order, and you don't know if they're going to come at 2 o'clock in the morning and demolish your home today, tomorrow, the next day. But this is only for like a very small, portion of the country, 40,000 demolition orders. Now, again, the northern part, the southern part, Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza, these are all run by separate agencies, by separate bureaucracies. Of course, it's all part of the Israeli government. This is not just apartheid. It's a kind of a diabolical type of apartheid that I don't know who are the sick people that sat and devised it, and then sat and imagine writing the details of the laws. Yes, we're going to add this, and 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 then we're going to call ourselves a democracy. And if anybody says we're not a democracy, they're anti-Semitic. Now, Jeremy Corbyn, his only crime was that he believed in the two-state solution. He was not against it. He was far less, his discourse about Palestine was far less than mine, in terms of his, he didn't call for rejecting the state of Israel and Zionism completely. He called for a two-state solution and justice within that. which I reject. So, and for that, he was taken down. And in 2017, I wrote an article saying Jeremy Corbyn will never make it to Downing Street 10. Israel will not allow it. And he came very close, but we're not going to allow him to get to become prime minister, and they did. And they, he's eventually he was, he can't even be a member of his own party anymore.
Yeah, you had Pompeo that came when I think he was addressing kind of Zionist or Jewish audience, Zionist audience, saying that they won't allow Jeremy Corbyn get into power. Which was just crazy. Obviously, you growing up in Israel, having a strong family background, obviously in Israel, you obviously came out of this, and obviously you're against it. How is it so many other people in Israel don't see this as kind of they grow up, or they must grow up and see there's an element of brainwashing here, and whatever you may think about having a Jewish state, the treatment of the Palestinians is obviously horrible. So why do such few people come out of it kind of like you?
That's a very good question, my friend. I ask that question all the time. Who knows? I mean, I can't explain it. I mean, the racism is prevalent. The education for racism is prevalent. It's obvious. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, there are books about. My sister is an educator, and she wrote a book about the racism in Israeli textbooks. It's called Palestine in Israeli school books. It's a systemically racist education. So it had to be. Otherwise, you can't create an apartheid state like this so effectively. And then you can't send people, young people who are maybe about your age, give them a gun and tell them to kill and shoot and destroy another nation who, by the way, has never had an army. Palestinians are perceived as a threat, described and illustrated as some kind of a terrible threat. Palestinians have never had a military force. There's never been a Palestinian army. There's never been a Palestinian tank. Or you know what I mean? And so how do you get people to agree to serve in the military, powerful military, strong military with a lot of all the bells and whistles and all the cutting edge weapons and the best training and the best money and the best food for the soldiers and everything, to go and fight an enemy that at best they have a semi-automatic rifle with a handful of bullets at best. And in Gaza they create these rockets, and that's it. There's no threat military. There's never been a threat. And the entire world, when Israel bombs the hell out of Gaza or goes into Jenin and massacres people, the whole world says, yes, Israel has a right to defend itself. Defend itself against what? This massive army is going in to defend who against what? There's never been a Palestinian army. There's never been a Palestinian tank or a brigade or anything. You know what I mean? There's never been a military. But go tell people now that the Palestinians are not a military threat. What threat? Who? What? A bunch of guys, again, maybe about your age, with a T-shirt and a semi-automatic with a handful of bullets. That's it. That's all they got. If they get injured, that's it. They have no medical care. Every bullet they shoot is over. It's finished. Who knows when they don't have like a supply chain. When Israel runs out of, well, Israel never runs out of it, but in one time they were bombing Gaza and they ran out of something, a particular bomb. Immediately the Americans sent an emergency supply to refill this. So God forbid they won't be, no child would be left unharmed in Gaza. This is the balance of power, but go tell it to people on the outside. They talk to you like, you're anti-Semitic if you say this.
Yeah, no, we're coming to obviously the end of the interview. I'd love to obviously pick your brain about loads of other stuff. So just kind of final question, then I was just going to ask for some book recommendations. So just you'd just obviously mentioned it there, but just how much does the US and kind of the Western world back Israel on the world stage in military format and economic format, just to kind of let people know who aren't aware just how much kind of they're backed by the West?
Well, it's not that they're backed by the West. The West is complicit in Israeli crimes. Israel is a rich country. Israel it gets all this foreign aid, billions of dollars of foreign aid from the U.S. They get billions of dollars from the from Germany. They, of course, they have a very robust arms industry that they sell and collaborate with all over everybody in Europe and beyond, and in Latin America and in Asia and so on. So the Europeans are complicit unless somebody stands up against it. The Americans too, unless somebody stands up and clearly stands up against it, they're complicit in these crimes. So it's not just support. And it's important for people to know, for people in the UK, for people around the world to know, if you do not stand up against it, you are complicit in these crimes against humanity, because these are crimes that are crimes against humanity. These are not small-time crimes, and people need, if your elected official, if your representative in Parliament says that they're a Zionist, they need to be told that if you're called, they're not going to get your vote. Why would you vote for somebody who declares themselves to support racism and brutality? Why would anybody vote for somebody like that? And that has to be made clear by us as the voters, by us as the taxpayers, to the elected officials, that is no longer, that there should be no tolerance for Zionism. There should be no tolerance for racism and supremacy anymore. But that's our responsibility.
Yeah, obviously there's so much you could obviously talk about with Israel, their bombing of Syria, their involvement obviously in Syria before that, the constant conflict they have with Lebanon, kind of their influence around the Iraq war, and there's just so much to talk about, the Israel lobby, kind of everything there. But we are kind of out of time, as I know you got to jump onto another interview. So just before you kind of tell people where to find your work, recommend your own books, could you, and I will put this all in the show notes up on the screen, I'll put your books that are just behind you there, but could you provide some book recommendations for people about Israel, Israel and Palestine, or kind of the Israel lobby or the Western influencer? You can email them to me after as well, if you think of any.
So my first book, The General Son, is a great primer, because it's an easy way for people who are struggling with the issue to kind of gently be brought into it through my journey. So there's this whole background of my background and the story of my grandparents, how they came, and my parents and my father and his trajectory, and on and on. So it's a great introduction for people who are struggling. And also, if a lot of times people say to me, well, I have a Jewish son-in-law and I'm not sure how to talk to him about this, or I have a Jewish friend, or whatever. This book is a great tool. It kind of eases people in, and it clarifies where things stand. Then they can make their own choices. And then I wrote another book called Injustice, which is the story of a US-based Muslim charity that was closed down after 9/11 with terrorism charges that were false. And then 5 American Palestinians ended up in federal prison, 2 of them for 65 years. And they're completely innocent, completely innocent. So that's the second book. I'm reading right now a really wonderful book by Avi Schleim, who is a historian. He's at Oxford, he's an emeritus, and he was born in Iraq. His family immigrated to, I see I'm getting that call from the other interview here. I can just email you this, okay? I'll email you this stuff.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on, and I'll put everything in the show notes, but I'll let you jump off.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.